So the hemp plant is credited for being the very first agricultural crop planted by humans. Because of its thick fibers, people found it useful to make essential things like clothing, rope, fishing nets, and paper. In the early 1600s, settlers from the Georgetown colony were decreed by this guy, King James, as in the same King James from the King James Bible, to plant 100 plants each to be able to export back to England. So it was illegal not to grow at this time. In 1631, hemp actually became legal tender in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. It was legal to pay your taxes in hemp. The colonists and their slaves, let's be honest, would grow hemp to support the expansion into Americas. Then here in 1700s, we have George Washington. George Washington had a huge interest in agricultural reform and experimentation. He felt it was the duty of the rich because failure was inevitable, and it was easier for the rich to be able to absorb the losses while new techniques were being perfected. At his farm here in Mount Vernon in Virginia, hemp was one of the main plants that he and his slaves, once again, grew. 1776, the Declaration of Independence was written on hemp paper. And then in the 1800s, we started developing more machinery as we moved into more of an industrial society. Cannabis indica was first introduced to the Western medicine by William O. Chabasny, this guy right here. He went to India in pursuit of scientific discoveries and brought it back to England and spread it all through America by 1850s. So it was seen as a medicine then. Cannabis use was on the rise. It was called a fashionable narcotic. Hash parlors and opium dens opened up in every major city in the East Coast. There were over 500 in New York alone. There was cocaine and heroin that was actually being marketed as something for children to teeth. But in 1906, we have the federal government came out with the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required any dangerous or addictive drugs to appear on the label. So 1906, it was the very first ever consumer protection law. All right, following the Mexican Revolution here in 1910, many Mexicans immigrated to the United States. There was a lot of outcry. There were racist sentiments surfacing. This is all sorts of beautiful stuff, terrible stuff put out there. This is William Randolph Hearst right here. He was a newspaper tycoon who owned a ton of publications, and he popularized the word marijuana. He posted it everywhere. He demonized the word. He tried to make it seem like it was something that was other than. He just tried to make people super, it was just a super awful scare tactic that he did. Also, not only did he own a ton of newspapers, but he owned acres and acres of forests and felt threatened by the hemp industry. In 1913, California made an addendum to the Poison Act and made it and became the first state to prohibit cannabis. I thought it was interesting that it was California that was the first to prohibit cannabis. And then later that year, Maine, Wyoming, and Indiana joined as well. This guy, Andrew Mellon, he was a wealthy man. He was the head of the world's largest oil company, which is now known as ExxonMobil. He became the Secretary of Treasury and served under a number of administrations. But his first task was to create the first legal tender, which he did on hemp paper. So we had not only hemp paper, but on the back right over here, they're plowing hemp as well. No, it's also Andrew Jackson here on the $10 bill instead of the 20. But again, this was back in 1914. So, and then December of 1922, Mary Jane Rathburn was born. We're going to get into her a whole lot more later, but I just thought it was really interesting to point out that she was still alive, that she was born and she was alive when cannabis was still federally legal. So until she was 13 years old. So she grew up and went to a Catholic school. And bear with me 1 second. Oh, yes, here we go. Here's Andrew Mellon's, Secretary of Treasury. This is his nephew right here, who is Harry Anslinger. He is the person who is behind prohibition. He said, right here, there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. So, a year later, the Reefer Madness film debuted. This was propaganda that was designed by a church, and the goal was to show that cannabis was an evil drug that encouraged people to engage in harmful activities. And then later, 1 year later, the Marijuana Tax Act was enacted, which made the possession or transfer of marijuana illegal throughout the United States by federal law. This guy right here, Samuel Caldwell, was the first man arrested for selling cannabis, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, heavy labor, and he died shortly after being released. Cannabis was illegal all over the place. So then in 1939, though, World War II started, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And after that happened in 1941, the United States became directly involved in World War II. War production had to be up and running super quickly, as fast as possible, and there was a shortage in fibers. Cannabis was made illegal 4 years earlier, so they couldn't really use that. And Japanese had the Philippines and India hemp under their thumb, so we weren't going to be able to get any of that transported. So we needed the fibers for rope, shoelaces, for parachutes, and more. And then the Department of Agriculture actually rolled this out in 1942. They came out with a Hemp for Victory campaign, which is just nuts to me. They encouraged farmers to start growing weed again after federally banning it. So the thing was, after the war, it went back to being prohibited, and the United States government pretended like it never happened for the next almost 50 years until the propaganda videotape surfaced. So then we had back to Mary Jane Rathburn. She moved out of her home as a teenager. She started getting really into social activism. She started traveling, campaigning for union development for minors. And then she started doing some abortion rights work. And then in 52, we have the Boggs Act, which basically required mandatory sentences of 2 years, 2 to 10 years, plus $20,000 fine, like minimum of 2 years for your first cannabis offense. Mary J. Rathburn, she moved to San Francisco where she met a man in the army at a USO dance. They married, but they soon divorced. This is the youngest picture that I could have possibly found of her while scouring the internet. She had a daughter named Peggy from her marriage, and she and Peggy moved to Reno, Nevada around this time. Then we get into this guy right here, Dennis Peron. In 1966, Dennis was drafted to serve in the Vietnam War. Before shipping out, he had a 20-day leave where he stopped over in San Francisco. It was the summer of love. It was the perfect timing. He said he tripped on acid, he met the hippies, he felt accepted, and he decided then that he was going to come back to San Francisco and live his life as a hippie faggot. Keep in mind, during this time in the 1960s, the police were actively raiding gay bars and harassing gay people, and the brutality was increasing nationwide. 1969 is when Stonewall happened. It's where a bar in New York, there were trans women of color decided to fight back against the police officers, and they rioted for 3 days. And then Pride is actually in remembrance of Stonewall, and the first Pride Parade happened 1 year later in 1970. So in Vietnam, Dennis is right here in the middle. In Vietnam, a lot of soldiers experimented with drugs for the first time, especially cannabis. They're smoking out of shotguns. And Dennis tried cannabis for the first time and just absolutely fell in love. After he was discharged, he loaded up his duffel bag with about 2 pounds and made his way to San Francisco to the neighborhood of the Castro district. He got involved in a hippie commune that housed 28 people, and he got involved in the group the Yippies, which is the Youth International Party, or politically driven hippies. During this time, Nixon was in office. So, President Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1971. He rolls out this Controlled Substances Act. He classifies drugs into 5 different levels here, equating cannabis to have no medical use and high potential for abuse as the worst of the worst. He also pushed to have mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. We knew we couldn't make it illegal, but illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This is from one of Nixon's policy advisor. Whew. So Dennis started the Island Democratic Club. There were about 90 to 200 people that would vote in elections as groups. So they actually had some power. They would get together and they would really shake up a vote. They could really help sink somebody or make somebody win. So in 1972, they got involved in their first campaign. Dennis got involved. It's Yes on 19, which was to remove penalties for the state of California, 18 or under, to use, possess, grow, process, or transport marijuana for personal use. So just it was the first attempt to legalize marijuana by voting in the history of United States. There were a lot of huge grassroots efforts happening, but ultimately the initiative failed with only 33% of the vote. But even though it failed, it created a ripple effect. Just a year later, Oregon became the first state to decriminalize cannabis, reducing the penalty to just a $100 fine. Nixon changes the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA. It was created, but thankfully he resigned from office just a year later amidst the Watergate scandal. Dennis Peron was really good friends with Harvey Milk. They were both originally from New York and Long Island, and they both transplanted over to San Francisco, both gay, politically driven stoners. Dennis actually worked on Harvey Milk's campaigns, his first two campaigns in 1973 and in 1975. And Harvey really encouraged people to protest California's cannabis laws through civil disobedience. They can't bust us all, he said. And then Mary, her only child, Peggy, was killed by a drunk driver. Peggy was only 22, and at that time, Mary moved back to San Francisco and got a job working as a waitress at this IHOP. Isn't she darling? So Mary and Dennis first met at Cafe Flore while sharing a joint. Dennis thought it was amusing that this little old lady wanted to get a little puff on the reefer, and they just became really good friends right after that. But then the commune that Dennis was a part of was raided. Dennis served 6 months in jail, and afterwards he got out and put down some money on this building right here on the corner of Sanchez and 16th Street, if anyone's familiar with San Francisco. But he opened up this restaurant right here called The Island, and upstairs was the Big Top Pot supermarket. And if you look right here at this corner, this is what the place looks like today. It's like a fusion brunch spot now. But it was a vegan restaurant, and upstairs is where they sold the weed. It was the only restaurant in the world where pot smoking was nearly mandatory, Dennis said. In 1975, California decriminalized cannabis by passing Senate Bill 95, the Moscone Act, named after Mayor Moscone. This guy right here, we can talk about him in just a second. Yes. So we got Jimmy Carter here. He becomes the president on a platform that included marijuana decriminalization. It was actually rumored that Jimmy Carter held a number of cannabis-fueled parties at the White House. Overall, things started looking pretty good for decriminalization. We were getting a couple states here and there in the later 80s, but it was not perfect. Dennis started, and Harvey Milk ran it for the city supervisor one last time, and he finally won in 1978. He became the very first openly gay elected official in United States history. And Dennis and Harvey, they put together Proposition W, as in weed, and it was to where the city of San Francisco urged the district attorneys and the chief of police to stop arresting and prosecuting those caught growing, cultivating, selling, and using cannabis. The measure actually passed, remarkably, by 63%. And Mayor Moscone here, he directed the police to ignore possession of under an ounce. Dennis was already in jail at this time when this happened. Um, the police raided his business and shot him in the leg. The in court, the police officer that shot him said that if he died, it would have just meant one less faggot in San Francisco. So interesting sentiments. And then on November 2nd, Harvey Milk and the mayor were assassinated. So yeah, by this guy right here, Dan White. He was a former city supervisor, and he was a homophobe, and he was against pot. He was super conservative and all this other stuff. But anyways, his lawyers argued his mental state had diminished capacity because of his depression. It became known as the Twinkie defense because he was binging on Twinkies and junk food. And yeah, they just said that he wasn't able to premeditate the killings, and he couldn't possibly be convicted of first-degree murder, and he was convicted of manslaughter instead, a lesser charge, and sentenced to 8 years in prison. And in a collective outrage, the gay community began to riot like crazy. They started smashing City Hall. They burned cop cars a lot. It was a pivotal moment. It was a signal to the San Francisco Police Department that they couldn't just keep beating and arresting gay people. So shortly after Dan White got out of, he committed suicide, which whatever. Because the mayor was assassinated as well. Down here, Feinstein becomes the mayor in his place. So she's now Senator Dianne Feinstein that we all know and love. She was always against cannabis and has been for decades and decades. And even though the proposition had passed, she did not enact it. And so it still, Proposition W was just never implemented. And then in 1980, here we have this conservative television personality who runs for president on a campaign to make America great again. And then his wife has her own campaign that just say no to drugs. Yeah, Nancy Reagan here. So in this time, Mary was making all sorts of brownies. She was making brownies for the public. She was selling them, making money, and she is selling them over at Dennis's supermarket. She was doing about 50 dozen brownies per day, and she put her advertisements up on San Francisco billboards, which is initially how the police found her and came to her as undercover in 1981. She was wearing a flower apron and said, "I thought you guys were coming." Her first arrest made national headlines, and the media just loved the fact that she looked like a little old lady, and she is coupled with her illegal activities, and they started calling her Brownie Mary. And then in 1981, later that year, AIDS was announced that it was discovered, but they saw it as a rare cancer that was only seen in homosexuals. They actually called it GRIDS for gay-related immunodeficiency before they called it AIDS, before they realized that it wasn't just gay people, even though it was predominantly gay people who were affected by this. Then doctors, they didn't know what caused it. There was no treatment at the time. It was just really ugly. And as it unfolded, San Francisco became ground zero because of how much of a gay mecca they had created there up until that point. By the end of the year, there were 159 cases in the United States. And one of the biggest characteristics of the disease were wasting syndrome, where your body just loses its appetites and you just become a human skeleton, and then lesions that appear on your body and on your face. And at the time, the White House was completely useless. President Reagan was pretending like AIDS wasn't even happening. He didn't even mention AIDS publicly for almost 5 years into the epidemic. 5 years, like that is fucking awful. So for Mary's arrest, she pleaded guilty to 9 counts of possession and received 3 years of probation. She was sentenced to 500 hours of community service, which she finished in record time of 60 days. This woman threw herself into volunteer work. She was everywhere from soup kitchens to thrift stores, but as the AIDS crisis was developing, she really started getting involved with AIDS support groups as well and volunteering there. And even though she had completed all of her volunteer time that she needed, she just kept volunteering. She just didn't stop. Mary and Dennis, their customers were mostly gay men. Mary lost her only child, so she became a mother to all these queer people who were abandoned by their families at this time. When they first started coming down with AIDS, she noticed that cannabis really helped them with their wasting syndrome. It helps them get the munchies. It helped them with their nausea. It helped them with their pain. And then people started donating cannabis to Mary, and she just started baking brownies in the hundreds in her kitchen every day for sick people free of charge. She used her Social Security check. She got $650 a month, but she used it for supplies for her brownies and had the weed donated for her. But cannabis was the only thing that they had for AIDS for years. Is the only thing. So in December 7th, 1982, Mary's just walking along, strolling along on the streets of San Francisco, and the cop that arrested her the first time recognized her and stopped her and asked to see what was in her bag. And Mary, being the woman that she was, it was full of brownies. She was on her way to a friend who was struggling with chemo at that point in time. They found that cannabis was also really helpful with cancer patients and chemo as well. And also they were trying chemo with AIDS patients too, here and there. It was just, they really didn't know what was working or what to throw at it. But yeah, Mary was arrested again. She was found in violation of her probation, and the district attorney eventually dropped her charges again because she was doing it not for financial gain, but because she was doing it to help these sick people who had no other option. End of it, 82, there were 771 cases and 618 deaths. That's like 95%. That's like 90% or whatever. That's like the death rate was staggering in the very beginning. It was basically a death sentence. In 83, it rose to about 2,000 and 2,800. So it's still like the ratio of survival was not great at this point in time either. But in 83, the San Francisco General Hospital opened Ward 86, which is the AIDS ward. Mary volunteered here weekly for years. She would wheel patients to radiology and take their specimens to the labs. And she was just really well known and well loved in this space. And then in 84, with the lack of any kind of guidance or directives from the government, local leaders had to take the crisis into their own hands. So San Francisco, for example, they closed down their sex clubs and bathhouses, and they funded private education ventures and community-based research. But people were still dying. Dennis moved into this home known as the Castro Castle. He turned it into it was a bed and breakfast. While the White House was still silent in 1985, celebrities started taking action. Like Elizabeth Taylor here, she announced the creation of the American Foundation for AIDS Research. And then later that year in 1985, this guy, what's his name? Rock Hudson. Yeah, Rock Hudson. He was an actor, and he was a really good friend of the Reagans, but he was also a closet case. So he had AIDS, and he passed away. And now that it affected the Reagan family directly, that is when Ronald Reagan finally decided to come out to the public and speak about it and do something about it. But there were already about 13,000 deaths at this point. 1986, the AIDS ward, they recognized Mary as Volunteer of the Year. In research efforts, the FDA approved AZT, which was developed about 15 years earlier for cancer, but the problem was it was so toxic. It was shelved and forgotten about because AZT, it would destroy cells, but they couldn't target and focus on which cells they were destroying. So it was actually killing people at a faster rate who were on it. By 1986, the end of it, there are about 25,000 deaths. And in 1987, they finally recognized AIDS Awareness Month. They started, the Surgeon General started an advertising campaign. We're at about 40,000 deaths. 1961 and 88. And then we have George H.W. Bush becomes the president right after. And he was not super great on cannabis or AIDS either, really. But right away, he enacts Operation Green Merchant here, which basically it was a nationwide investigation, an operation that targeted businesses that advertised hydroponics and lights. They also subpoenaed records from UPS of customers that purchased this type of equipment so that they could raid their homes. Then we're at 89,000 deaths right there. Cannabis in 1990, we're starting to get a little bit more decriminalized. We're at about 10 states at this point in 1990. Dennis had basically stopped selling cannabis at this point because his partner, Jonathan West, had full-blown AIDS. And so he was taking the time to be his caretaker. then. So, but even regardless of that, a squad of police officers showed up to their house right over here. There's the Castro Castle in the squad car right there, and they busted Dennis for selling pot. They only found 4 ounces of Thai weed in the house, and it was Jonathan's because he was really sick. He is really thin and had lesions on his face.
My house.
And then the cops made a big production while they were there about him being so sick. They were putting on their rubber gloves, and they were just talking about they were just being asshole cops while they were tearing up the place. And Dennis recognized one of those cops as being the bodyguard of the mayor who was assassinated, like who, you know, didn't do a great job of protecting the guy that he was supposed to serve. So he just gave him a little backhanded, nice job you did protecting George, just while he was getting raided. But Dennis went to jail again. He was no stranger to jail. But in 1990, when he was in jail at this time, he had a vision of the Cannabis Buyers Club. The police officers were taunting him.
Thank you.
He was just thinking about his partner who was all alone without any cannabis, and he just wished that there were a place where his partner could be, where he could have access to his medicine and wouldn't be ashamed. And that's where he dreamt up the idea for the Cannabis Buyers Club. Then in September of 1990, Jonathan, his partner, testified at Dennis's trial about the confiscated pot, and he was wasted away to about 90 pounds at this time. The court dropped all the charges, and 2 weeks later, Jonathan died. So it was basically like he was hanging on just long enough to testify on Dennis's behalf. So right after that, well, we're at 120,000 deaths, which still death rate is still not looking too hot, but, you know, getting a little bit better, I suppose. But Dennis and Mary, they start working on Proposition P, as in pot this time, instead of W for weed. And it was to ask the state of California to let patients of AIDS, glaucoma, cancer, and other illnesses to not be prosecuted, and to not prosecute doctors who prescribed cannabis. And Proposition P was passed with an overwhelming 80% of the vote in November of 1991. It didn't have any force of law, but it was a resolution declaring that the city supported medical marijuana. And then Santa Cruz and other cities followed shortly thereafter with other endorsement laws for medical marijuana. We're at 156 deaths at end of 91. In 1992, Mary was arrested for the 3rd time. She was at her nephew's house, Stephen, and she was baking brownies. They caught her in the act, and she was scared. She called up Dennis, and she's like, "What am I gonna do?" And he says, "We're gonna fight." He said, "This is the best news ever." He said, "I'm going to get out my Rolodex." And he starts calling everyone in the news that he knew. He started calling up ABC and NBC and CBS and all of the papers. And soon enough, they were in media that was international. They were everywhere. And then eventually Mary won. And even they just gave up on trying to charge her at that point. They're just like, you're doing, like, she was doing it not for profit. She stopped selling after the first time she was busted. It was all to give it away. And so after her third and final arrest, which she won, the police finally left her alone from that point forward. And then she's like, okay, well, I'm going to still keep on doing what I'm doing. And she went back to baking brownies. And then the city of San Francisco, just a month later, named a day in her honor, August 25th. So 2 days ago was Brownie Mary Day. In 1992, Dennis had this plan for a political stunt, because that's the kind of guy he was. He loved publicity. He loved the news. They decorated a downstairs apartment of this building right here at the corner of Ford and Sanchez to look like a cafe. They got about a dozen patients together who were really sick, who would feel comfortable buying and selling weed on TV. So they called up a TV station to a secret location in the Castro for the Cannabis Buyers Club, which there was no real club at the time. It was just pretend. It was just a show for the cameras, just to be on TV. What they were doing was they were trying to bait the cops to arrest Dennis. They wanted to have a case to go to court so that they could legalize cannabis once and for all. But the thing was, the cops never came. They just didn't. They just left him alone. And they didn't take the bait. The TV station that aired it, they got about 300 phone calls from gay people around the city who had AIDS, and they were wondering where they could join the club that they saw on TV. And they were like, well, fuck, now what do we do? Like, there is no real club. So Dennis, being the person that he was, he's like, bring them to me. We're just gonna create it out of that home, out of that basement apartment right here. So they opened it up for a couple hours twice a day. And they expected the bust, but it never came. Hundreds of people were coming and going a day. But they had one person who came and said, you're not going to believe how I heard about you guys. I got busted in Dolores Park, which is this park here, trying to buy some pot. The cops busted me, and I told them my story. I told them I have AIDS, and they gave me my pot back. They said they weren't going to arrest me, but I shouldn't be buying pot in Dolores Park. They told me that I should come to your house, and they gave me your address. So at this point, it didn't seem like they were going to get their bust. So they brought in more media, and they asked the media, hey, you can talk to anybody in here, but just ask them why they're here. Ask them about why they are using cannabis and why they have their conditions and how it helps them. So we're at about really close to 200,000 deaths at this point in 1992. So, right around here where we are now with the COVID mark. And then in 93, Dennis and Mary, they came out with a cookbook for recipes for edibles. And deaths keep climbing. But in 1994, Dennis got really bold, and he rented out this place, which this is what it looks like now. This is not what it looked like then. But this is the second location of the Cannabis Buyers Club. it was, they had chalkboards that announced the prices. They had non-alcoholic beverages, smoking section for people in wheelchairs, and all sorts of things. They were just really super bold. Then, yeah, numbers still climbing. And they kept bringing different bills to the table, but the governor at the time just kept saying that they were just too radical. And then in 1995, Dennis got this building right here, this 5-story building, which they named the Brownie Mary Rathburn building. It was the third and final location of the Cannabis Buyers Club. I was actually, yesterday I had the wonderful opportunity to speak to 2 individuals. One was the very first patient of the Cannabis Buyers Club, who just remarkable story, and I couldn't believe that he was still alive today, and that he just had so many really neat things to share with me. And also, I spoke with another individual who worked at the AIDS ward there in San Francisco, and he drove patients to and from this location. Um, from the AIDS ward to be able to get their cannabis. He said that they would send down the boys to come down the stairs, and anytime there was somebody in a wheelchair, they would just carry them up the flights of stairs. No one was left behind. Here we got a map. If anyone's super familiar with San Francisco, here's a map of where all of those locations have been. The Castro Castle, right around from where the supermarket was, the second and third locations, as well as the AIDS ward. So it's all really clustered right here in the Castro area. And here's a couple photos from the Cannabis Buyers Club. One thing I thought was really interesting over here was they had no weed that they rated under a B. So, so like everything's good. I just found that really, really interesting. But they had all sorts of edibles and tinctures here. They had lounge spaces and support groups, just all sorts of things happening. AIDS was still blowing up, and in 95 it actually became the leading cause of death amongst all Americans 25 to 44, the leading cause of death. So 96, Mary started slowing down. She was starting to lose a lot of weight. She wasn't really able to bake anymore, but she was still active and doing things. Dennis and this guy, John Entwistle, who has been his business partner and for years and years, they crafted together Proposition 215 and a number of other things. But it was the first ever statewide medical marijuana bill that they brought to the table in 1996. And it sought to allow patients to be able to grow their own weed and to have their own weed without, with the recommendation of a physician. They brought together doctors, nurses, clergy people, politicians. And then there's this guy. This guy, he is the California Attorney General, Dan Lundgren. He absolutely despised Dennis. We'll talk about him more in a second, but in 96, Proposition 215 passed just barely, which actually made cannabis state law. Finally, it was the first time ever. and it created a ripple effect. In 1996, Bill Clinton was president at the time. Even though cannabis became legal in California, the feds, the Department of Justice, under Bill Clinton, sought to prosecute doctors that recommended cannabis. At this time, the numbers started to fall because the combination therapies, they started to make a breakthrough. There was more money being put into research, and they were finally getting somewhere. So the death rate was actually starting to fall here in 96. In 1997, Dennis Peron and Brownie Mary, they were honored as the Grand Marshals of the San Francisco Pride Parade. In 1998, Dennis ran for governor against that guy who hated him so much, the Attorney General. And during the campaign, the Attorney General filed all sorts of lawsuits against Dennis. He sent undercover agents to the club, and he harassed medical patients and growers. Dennis ended up coming in 5th place, and the San Francisco Buyers Club was ordered to close by a Supreme Court judge once and for all in 1998. They had served over 8,000 members by the time that they had closed. Dennis started shifting his interests from selling into farming so he could give it away to people instead. He bought a farm in Northern California, in Clear Lake, California, about 100 miles north of San Francisco, a 20-acre farm. And he started growing for the first time. He found it amusing that he sold weed forever, and he had never grown it until then. Like, he waited until way, way later to learn how to grow. And then on April 10th in 1999, Brownie Mary passed away from a heart attack. And her friend, district attorney, said that she would be remembered as the Florence Nightingale of the medical marijuana movement. Then, so we see here, we have some medical that's starting to pop up all over the West Coast in 2000. But here we get into the Bush administration, where federal officials started to step up and crack down on medical marijuana in California even harder. There's currently more than 100 people facing federal charges in medical marijuana cases. The DEA conducted more than 50 raids in 2007 alone. And here you can see all of the spikes in the cannabis arrests, which haven't really stopped even with the legalization. The DEA started threatening landlords of places that rented to these types of businesses. The news said that the federal enforcement was noticeably erratic, just going in and ransacking places all the time. But then in 2009, President Obama announced that he would end the Bush administration's frequent raids on medical marijuana distributors. So they would end the raids, but the arrests would still continue, and the arrests are still at an all-time high in all of these states that still do not have legalization. So throughout the 2000s, cannabis became more legal throughout the United States. As we can see here, in 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first to legalize cannabis fully. And then California in 2016, right after that. Dennis returned back to the Castro Castle in San Francisco when he was diagnosed with lung cancer. The city of San Francisco, they recognized him with a certificate of honor, dubbing him the father of medical marijuana. This is him just at Hemfest on the main stage here in Seattle. He then published his memoirs, How a Gay Hippie Legalized Marijuana in Response to the AIDS Crisis. And in January of 2018, California opened their doors to their first retail cannabis stores. And a couple weeks later, Dennis passed. Just a couple weeks later. So he got to see the legalization of cannabis, but he didn't support recreational use like so many of the people that we know and love from medical days will say. He felt that all cannabis use was medical. And people just didn't want to admit it. He felt that that legal recreational cannabis favored large corporations and it pushed out the small operators. And now, even though we are more legal than we have been in a very long time, we still have a long way to go. People are still getting arrested. We still have prohibition. Medical patients are still being rated for having too many plants. Cannabis businesses still do not have access to banking or insurance, which is a huge issue. No other business has to go through this. Just recently, like within the last couple months, there were about 20 pot shops broken into in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the police would not answer any of their calls. I think that's pretty ridiculous in 2020. But in 2019, we had Governor Newsom here. He signed SB 34, which is the Dennis Peron and Brownie Mary Act, which was to support businesses to be able to donate cannabis to patients tax-free. The bill was sponsored by Senator Scott Wiener, who is a representative of District 11, and he is also a gay Jewish man. And I wanted to mention one more incredible individual who has been instrumental in bringing inclusivity into the industry. And she is also here in this call, but Amy Warner right here is this incredible human being right here in Seattle, a lesbian woman, the founder of the Women of Weed organization and the owner of Cannabis Basics, which is a line of cannabis topicals. Yeah, she's got her button right there. Love it. Love you so much. Glad that you're on the call. She helped write legislation to allow products to have under 0.03% THC on shelves in non-recreational stores. So her products can be found all over. Yeah. And yeah, that is all I had for this presentation.